All right, welcome back. Let's talk about the physiology of muscle. How does muscle actually do its job? And what is its job? Its job is one thing, shortening. It contracts. It does that when we move around because muscles attached to bones and it moves those bones around and that makes us move around. It also can support soft tissue like the stomach wall muscles can support the gut underneath. Also, muscles what moves stuff in and out of the body. You can think of your food stuff like your tongue and your movement of the mouth chewing, and well, you get the rest of it as well, I'm sure. And then the other thing that muscle can do when it's really cold, it contracts rapidly, and that's called shivering, and that generates a lot of heat because a lot of the byproduct of the muscle is heat. So when we look at the characteristics of muscles, we can, well, the second one here, we see its contractility. That's really all it actively does. It shortens. It's the ability to shorten. It's triggered by a nerve impulse to do that, and it is caused by some small, tiny little protein thread that are inside the whole length of the muscle. So you got a whole bunch of wrappings, and on the inside, what actually does the work is some protein threads. One of them lays there and the other one pulls on it, and that makes the muscle shorten. That's basically it. Other characteristics are that we can actually irritate the muscle, we can excite it, we can say a nerve impulse can go to it and then it contracts. So that's excitability, we can call that irritability. That has nothing to do with being irritable, that just means we're reactive. And also we can call that responsiveness. That's another word for it. Then the muscle passively extensible. So it can extend or stretch. And that's extensibility. And then elasticity is the ability to recoil. It means goes back into its original length. And muscle can also do that. Thank God it can. When we look at the terms, when we see words that carry the term myo, or mys, mus of something, musio, that means muscle. Another term we often use for muscle stuff is sarco. So that means actually flesh. But when you see those three prefixes, you know muscle is at the discussion table. All right, we have a few types of muscle. We have the one that we kind of consider as the main muscle type, and that's the skeletal muscle. And that muscle moves mainly bones around. So that's attached, you think of your biceps in front of you, right? It's attached to the forearm. Well, now we know that's actually, the radius and the ulna down there. And then it reaches up into the shoulder and it anchors into the shoulder area. So it moves when it contracts. But we have these long fibers that go from one end of the muscle to the other end, those threads, and they are actually the one things that contract. So if you look at this slide here, you see how there's a long slide. It's very parallel. Everything is very parallel. So that's the length of the muscle right here, this one. It goes parallel this way. So we call that muscle long cylindrical cells that are multinucleated. So you see all these black dots in here, these These are nuclei. So they're more than one in one cell because that muscle cell as a one cell is the whole length of the muscle. And that's a long muscle. That muscle can go, well, the biceps is long, but you can have one from your hip down all the way to your knee. That's even longer. And so because in embryological development, we can't just make a cell that's that long and it just grows in length and length. But what they do is they fuse together. So embryological cells fuse together, create a cell with more than one nuclei because the nuclei will stay behind. So that's kind of cool. That muscle tissue is also voluntary or conscious. So when we activate that muscle, we consciously activate that muscle. We think about moving that muscle. We might not say, oh, we're moving the biceps as that, but we might say, we'll walk to the car or something, and then the brain will make sure we move the right muscles to get us walking. So that's what that means. And when we look at the microscopic one, it says striated microscopic look created by internal protein thread arrangement. That's that parallel structure. You also, if you go close, you see some lines going up and down as well. that's actually the area where one of these protein threads is anchored on sections along the muscle. And we actually, when we study the little smallest thing where we can study how it works, we take one of those from one of those up and down lines to the next up and down line in the lengthwise one. And we take one of those little things and we study how it works. We'll do that in a few minutes. But we also have other muscles. We have cardiac muscle, and that's heart muscle. Look, that looks a little bit goofier. That's actually just your heart. And so that's more of a branched look. And these cells are not combined together. They just have one nucleus. And so they stay smaller, but they only have one nucleus. So that's a good thing. They are involuntary or unconscious. So we don't have to think about contracting those. And that's a really good thing, because you don't want to have to think about pumping your blood around the body. It just needs to happen. They're also pretty striated the way they look, because the internal arrangement of the muscle is quite similar to the skeletal muscles, but they have these intercalated discs. And we talked about them. They are combinations of gap junctions and desmosomes. Remember, gap junctions leave a little gap between cell and cell, so there's a little straw going from cell membrane through the cell membrane from cell to cell. And the desmosome are anchors. They make everything very tough, so you can't rip them apart. And so the intercalated disc has that, because that helps ions pass through that muscle tissue, and ions is what carries a nerve impulse through a tissue. And so therefore muscle tissue is actually kind of has its own neurology to it. It spreads its own nerve cell, goes through it. And in the other muscles, the skeletal muscles, it functions different. We're actually going to talk about that as we look into the detail. But we have a third muscle type, and the third muscle type is smooth muscle. And look at that, it looks totally different. That looks totally different. It's like spindle cell things. One nucleus in the middle, one end of the muscle to the other end of the muscle cell. It kind of looks like a big muscle when you take a big biceps out. The ends get thinner and the middle is wider. And that's where the nucleus is. But these are the cells, so they're not like whole muscles. They're just muscle cells. So they are also involuntary. Also, thank the Lord, because when your stomach growls, who's going to do? That's actually what happens. When your stomach growls, that kind of stuff is contracting, those muscles. And again, you actually rather be able to turn that off sometimes, but you don't want to have to think about it. They contract slow. They're wave pattern contractions. We call them peristalsis. And that's kind of when you, well, never mind. We'll talk about that when we go to the gut. And they can sustain a contraction for a long time. So that's also an interesting feature that they have. So skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Let's go and dive into the skeletal muscle. That's the one we're really going to talk about. That's a goofy one. So the skeletal muscle has some unique structures to accommodate the fact that muscle needs to be stimulated, number one, by a nerve impulse, and muscle tissue basically contracts, which is shortening, which is we take the two ends of the muscle where they attach and we shorten the muscle. That means the two bones are pulled closer to one another, and that creates movement, or that of course helps us hold the posture so we don't collapse onto the ground. So we have myofibril, and when you take a muscle apart, so when you take this is a muscle cell. This is not a muscle, this is a muscle cell. So that's one cell, one fiber out of many parallel fibers that make a big muscle. So then when you dissect one of those muscles, you have a few weird structures. So you have these internal muscle length looking cylinder things that are making up this muscle cell. And these are special organelles. They are called myofibril. They are long thread-like organelles in muscle that will then contract the muscle. So these are actually the organelles that will do the work. They will contract. Don't worry, we got more. Because what we have around them, or around the whole muscle actually, is a sarcolemma. And that actually means muscle membrane. Sarco is muscle and lemma means membrane. And that's going around the whole muscle. That's a cell membrane basically. But what's interesting, and we can see that here, it also then goes deep into the muscle and it penetrates the muscle cell, these yellow things, and it goes deep and around every myofibril at intervals. And actually, this is one of the intervals that we're going to study of how the muscle contracts. These are, by the way, is also the place where on a slide you see these up and down lines. That's the same place. And so in those intervals, those sarcolemma penetrate deep. They call that T tubules. Don't ask me why they call that T tubules. They just do. So the sarcolemma carries that nerve impulse deep into the muscle, and that then stimulates the muscle contraction. Does that make sense? But now, before the muscle can actually shorten, we have one more thing that we need to put in there. Oopsies. Right there. We have one more step that we need to plug in. See that blue stuff in here? This stuff? Good. Those are bags. Look, they look like baggy-like things, and they have calcium in them, and calcium ions. And those baggy blue things are called Sarcoplasmic Reticulum. Let's see that up here? Sarcoplasmic Reticulum. It's actually a specialized endoplasmic reticulum. Remember, that's the stuff that makes proteins and fatty stuff. And so in there, all we have is calcium in there. So that's all we have. Because when a nerve impulse comes down, the yellow stuff here, the nerve impulse comes down, all that nerve impulse actually does, it stimulates the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and then the sarcoplasmic reticulum releases calcium ions into the inside of the myofibril. Well, then let's have a look now of what that's going to do. So let's have a look on the inside of the myofibril. Ta-da! Right there. So inside of myofibril, we have two threads.